Welcome to By-The-Bywater, a podcast on the Megaphonic Network. I'm Ned Raggett.
I'm Oriana Schwint.
I'm Jared Pekacek.
And we're here to talk about all things J.R.R. Tolkien, his work, his inspirations and impact, creative interpretations in other media, languages, lore, rip-offs, parodies, anything we think is interesting. Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome to the 22nd episode of By-The-Bywater. It is a new year. It is great to be back with you. We all had a well-deserved break. I hope you had a good one. I was 2 weeks off of work, and I am grateful. It'll kick in again tomorrow. We were just talking earlier how everyone's was going pretty well. It was, both Oriana and I were comparing notes that it was our first Christmases ever away from our families. So it was
Love
just...
it.
And
Highly recommend.
Oh, mine too.
Oh, yeah, that's right. We're all worried.
Yeah,
So.
how did your goose turn out, Jared?
Oh, it was, well, I overcooked it.
All right.
Go.
I didn't know that they were so tricky because it went right from several degrees underdone to several degrees overdone. And that was the whole thing. But yeah, it turned out the sauce was really good. It was a useful experience. And I've got a ton of goose fat for cooking potatoes in, or whatever you use goose fat for.
That sounds great. Quite honestly, yes. I was able to keep track of some of Jared's cooking because there was the megaphonic sort of take your pick special that we were running all Christmas Day with people doing comments and special appearances. We didn't do anything specific ourselves tied in with the podcast, but we all checked in one way or another, and it was very good to see Jared's goose literally being cooked, so, as it were. So
that joke, that joke was made so many times on the stream itself, and then my dad texted me later, "Is your goose cooked?" And I was like, I know he wasn't watching, but like,
you see, we were just ramping up to the dad joke level, and then he delivered it. He delivered the song. That's when you just cherry on top of the cake.
I feel like it would have been disappointing if he hadn't, honestly. Like,
yeah.
Too perfect. So, well, it is a new year, and we hope a better one all around. Hoo boy! But we do actually have some news, sort of, from things to share. So why don't we just get into that, and then the main topic. So, leading off once again, Jared, please take it away.
So it turns out there was some actual news about the Amazon TV series to see out the year, though there's still a lot that's not really known. The major announcement came from the production itself, where 20 more actors were specifically named as part of the cast. As before, there's no indication who is playing what role, so speculation is all that can be offered there. But, like the initially announced cast members a year ago, it's a mix of performers from a number of countries, both newer and older figures in the field, and again, very notably, not all white either. Among the more well-known names includes famed UK actor and comedian Lenny Henry, UK-born, US-based Cynthia Addai-Robinson, and in a first, a veteran from Peter Jackson films, Peter Tate, who's a New Zealand performer who had a role as an orc in The Lord of the Rings. Meanwhile, based on an Instagram post from opening episodes, director and overall executive producer J.A. Bayona bidding farewell to New Zealand for the moment, the series' first season itself has apparently finished filming. There's still nothing yet beyond word that the series is due to appear sometime this year, though perhaps by the time this episode airs, maybe we'll find something else.
Yes, and we should know we're recording this on the 3rd, and I would not put it past them to all of a sudden, have something come out in the next week or so that instantly outdates this part of it, so... Yeah.
And we are recording on Tolkien's birthday.
January
3rd.
Yeah, another bit of news. So, celebrations of the good man's memory. It's some motion, but as I think all three of us agree, we're still groping in the dark. It's nice to have all these names, at least. Mm-hmm. But otherwise, I mean, it's some interesting choices. I mean, I singled out Lenny Henry because it was sort of like my initial reaction was, really, Lenny Henry? And then I thought, yeah, why not Lenny Henry? Because, I mean, I remember seeing clips of him, like, back in the late 80s. I mean, his reputation had already come over here, just his comedian stuff. But he had already started branching out and doing other things, and he's just, living legend status at this point. So he's just a very intriguing addition to the cast. And it is fun to have that weird indirect connection to the direct/indirect connection to the Jackson films. It'd be hilarious if he's supposed to be playing the same orc. I assume not, but...
Yeah.
How long do orcs live? We don't know. One other name, I forgot to mention, is Maxim Baldry, who has been added to the cast because he notably had been included in the original cast rumors and then it dropped out, and now he's added back in. So maybe the space opened up in the schedule when everything changed, or who knows? Maybe the original was originally cast for. But again, nobody knows who's doing what. We don't know. This is driving me mad.
I've adopted a much more zen attitude, but I wonder if I feel like I might have mentioned this on the last episode, but I don't remember. This, like the beginning of January, is usually when the Television Critics Association press tour happens, where the networks and streamers trot out their new shows to critics and reporters for the entertainment industry, and I am unsure what the plan is for that this year, but if they do even some sort of virtual thing, we can probably expect some news, I imagine, about this. So yeah, just we'll be keeping an eye out, talk about it on Twitter, so definitely follow us there.
In all caps.
yes. Among all the other, we've been sharing all sorts of random Tolkien related tweets these past couple of days. Maybe because of the birthday, everyone's doing a rewatch and all that. We won't share all of them, but let's just say that Jared found one involving ants that was something we can't quite politely describe here. But there are such things as ant thirst traps. It turns out.
Can we say like thick ents? Is that allowed?
We may have to link in the show notes, but that's all we're going to say. Just, oh dear.
Or just check my Twitter feed.
Yeah,
Just there somewhere.
Remember, follow us on Twitter. You know how to find us. It's always in the end. I'm with you in terms of, theoretically we could get something, because this is what happened this time last year. They sort of, they did the initial thing. The other thing that crosses my mind, this is kind of but maybe, is that if Bezos and company are serious about trying to get some, attention for themselves, especially after Disney's massive, hey, here's all 8 million things we've got coming out on Disney Plus. Now's about the time, because they're doing that, and DC is trying to ramp up things through. Now that HBO Max has finally worked out its arrangement with everything, it's almost sort of like, why not try and, claw some space back? So I wouldn't be surprised if something happened. And again, it seems like the time of year.
Up until the last year or two, it really has felt like kind of an afterthought, like kind of a, well, let's throw some stuff into, let's throw some money at streaming video and see what happens. But with like The Boys had a very well received second season. True. It seems very popular. A lot of people, at least in my Twitter feed, are rediscovering The Expanse, or discovering The Expanse, which originally aired on Sci-Fi and then shifted to Prime. So I wonder if they are going to really, with this and The Wheel of Time, just, this is going to be their big splash.
Absolutely. And yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if we got an announcement basically highlighting both of them, saying like, hey, we are in major player territory, and adding to the point about not merely genre offerings that Prime has, which is, clearly they can build on with this, but, stuff like Fleabag got attention to with its second season last year, and there are other examples. So yeah, you could argue that Prime is now in a prime place to finally showcase both. Scott, thank you everyone. There's my own dad joke, and it's going to be that type of painful day maybe.
Yep.
It's a new year. We're all delirious. It's what.
Yeah, I was like, oh no, I feel like I have cotton in my head. Like,
yeah. I mean, tomorrow, returning to routine tomorrow, even though I'm not going anywhere, will be. I don't want to say it'll be welcome, but you're like, okay, yeah, right.
Structure.
Just going back into that. So there's the weird benefits, but other than that, there's really not much more to add. It's just a quiet time of year. We've gone through 1 year into another, so it is time to go ahead and move on to our main topic. The subject has come back around to me, and so I will start it away here. Written in the mid-60s and originally published in 1967, Smith of Wootton Major is notable for a key reason alone. It was the last written work of fiction Tolkien created that was published in his lifetime. He continued to work on Middle-earth material in various ways in the 6 years that followed before his death, primarily further revisions on what would eventually be transformed into the Silmarillion. But the separate effort that was Smith was the last new work from Tolkien for 10 years until the posthumous publications began appearing. Published in a small book form and receiving both initial critical and popular attention as Tolkien's first new non-poetry work since The Lord of the Rings itself, Smith has, like since many of his works, been anthologized in a variety of forms since, along with other of his shorter works. For our discussion, the focus will be on the Verlin Flieger edited edition from 2005, which, like a variety of the other short works published in the 21st century, includes a large amount of contemporary notes, drafts, and further details that shed remarkable light not merely on the story itself, but Tolkien's own creative and philosophical impulses. These materials are worthy of study because, as Tolkien himself clearly said at the time, the story is very much the work of an older man thinking back on his creative life, as well as his day-to-day one. It was described in almost elegiac terms by contemporary critics, but Tolkien himself didn't necessarily see it as a farewell. He'd often expressed a strong belief that he might live longer than he did, while the loss of his wife Edith and the intended impact was still some time to come. Its genesis was very Tolkien in form. Earlier in the 1960s, he had been approached to write a preface for a new edition of The Golden Key, a notable story for children Tolkien remembered from his youth from the Scottish Victorian age writer and minister George MacDonald. In his own telling of it, Tolkien had reread the work and found MacDonald's moralizing to be too overt for his adult tastes, but gamely began a preface that soon turned into a brief consideration of the power of Faery, F-A-E-R-Y, the subject of his own famed essay on fairy stories. He then asked his planned audience to consider the outline of a fairy story construction he wrote out, only to literally stop there and start developing the story completely separately. The preface itself was never completed, and the project died on the vine. It's a very Tolkien characteristic.
Yeah.
One of the many instances where something seems to literally appear or come to him as he writes that rapidly becomes central. As finally completed and revised, Smith, akin to, but not exactly like, the heavily mock-historical Farmer Giles of Ham, is set in a never-never England without a fixed date or basis in reality, pre-industrial and vaguely medieval. The town of Wootton Major has as its center a great hall that is based particularly around cooking and feasting, where a master cook oversees major gatherings and, every 24 years, hosts a 24 feast where a great cake is served to a small group of children. After some backstory, we encounter Smith himself as a child at one of these feasts, who unawares has swallowed a trinket that was included with the cake, a silver star that is said to come from the land of Faery. He later realizes this when, suddenly overcome with a new impulse to sing later that night, finds the star falling out of his mouth, and in surprise claps it to his forehead, where it stays for many years. The story then tells of the days of Smith and his family and contemporaries, as Smith, through the power of the star and his own expanded imagination, finds himself able to visit the lands of Faery during numerous trips away from home, all while marrying and raising children and gaining a reputation as a fair and honest blacksmith with a notable creative flair in his work. In Faery, he sees sights both beautiful and sublimely terrifying, but after many years he finds himself in a series of encounters with powerful figures that signal to him his time to visit Faery must draw to a close, while a new generation may yet have the chance to follow in his footsteps. This is not the entirety of the story or its themes by any means, neither is it the full structure. We'll go into things in much more detail in our subsequent discussion. But as Flieger says in her descriptive notes, discussing not only the story but the various associated materials, including a chronology and a lengthy essay of the same name as the story, where Tolkien explains the story's origins and goals, Tolkien himself may have been protesting a little too much when he claimed the story was not allegorical, as he famously did about Lord of the Rings. Smith of Wootton Major is, as Flieger says and is clearly evident, much different than his other creative short works, neither as rambunctious or ridiculous as his shorter tales from the 1920s or 30s, nor invested with the clearly theological seriousness of his major short work of the 1940s, Leaf by Niggle. While it's not thoroughly or simply a self-portrait, and Tolkien was at private pains to emphasize wider generalities, that element is nonetheless there, the story of a figure who is tied to the workaday world and that of family, home, and hearth, while entranced by the suggestive power of a wider imaginative scope that ended up enthralling him. But the story has elements all its own that showcase how it came from Tolkien's pen, but wasn't simply Middle-earth redux, ranging from a mountain lake with images of strange beasts in its depths that proves to be as solid and clear as glass, to the awestruck son of Smith, named, and I swear I didn't choose the story for this reason, Ned, looking at the looming mysterious shadow of Smith upon a return home and saying he seems as big as a giant. There's more elements to discuss as well with ties to Tolkien's other work, as well as the fact that Smith was the last book project that was done in conjunction with Pauline Baynes, who had started work with Tolkien 2 years prior with Farmer Giles of Ham. Here, her striking medieval-inspired depictions exchange the merry comedy of the earlier work for images both quietly amusing and deeply moving, and we'll have more thoughts about that to come as well. But it is about time, in fact, to move on to that discussion, and so I now once again open up the floor. So, what do you guys think?
So I had actually read it before with Farmer Giles of Ham, so I actually had the two mixed up in my mind. I thought they were the same story.
Oh.
Turns out they're not. And I enjoyed it a lot, but also what really got me was this. It's a little novella. It's not really a short story. It's a little longer than that, but the volume is novel length, and like 3/4 of it is supplemental material.
Yes.
It's so Tolkien.
It is absolutely Tolkien, yes. It is. The amount of backstory and thought he put into what's supposed to be a short little story is, I won't call it ridiculous, but it's just incredibly typical.
It's like there's a timeline with numbered years. There's like a whole history of somebody who's a fairly minor character in the story itself. It's just like, even with this, all of his creative impulses are fully on display. It was, I think, a little bit ridiculous. Like, it's just a short story. I don't know why you needed to do all this, my dude. But I enjoyed it a lot. It reminded me kind of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell.
Oh, okay. Right.
With this sort of mundane world that is infused with Faery. And the fairies have their own weird agenda that's going on. Mm-hmm. I don't have much more points of comparison.
I think maybe an idea could also be, now that you phrase it that way, sort of mundanity and sort of the workaday world thing could be, might have mentioned something before, I can't remember, Ursula K. Le Guin and Earthsea, because magic there is very workaday. And I don't think there's a connection between the two. Obviously, Le Guin read Tolkien and said as much, but I believe the Earthsea material was already being developed by the time the publication of the story originally. I'd have to check on the chronology, but I do like that emphasis on something, on mundanity in a very particular way. But I'll stop there. There's more I can say. Turning it over to you, Oriana, besides it being a nice story, anything in particular leaps out at you initially about it? Or
I actually have a lot of questions. So there's a timeline. What else is in the supplemental material? And for people, I don't know, maybe we have listeners who did, like me, also did not have access to. It's tough buying books over Christmas.
That is true enough. And yes, we should emphasize that this material is only in the Verlyn Flager. I think that's how she pronounces her name. We'll have a link to the edition in the show notes. Specifically, it's only in that edition. It most often is found in anthologies. The most recent anthology collection is the one I think we mentioned before, Tales from the Perilous Realm, which is the one with its all Alan Lee illustrations, which, again, great to have Alan Lee, but it is really worthwhile to see it with the original illustrations that Tolkien had seen and approved of.
Yeah, the Pauline Baynes ones, you can Google them. I have just done so, and they are delightful.
I do want to come back to those, but the supplemental material. There's the essay that he wrote about it, which is like the length of the story itself, where he talks about the meanings and themes.
Mm-hmm. There's definitely more to get into there. I almost want to get into the story itself a bit more first, but then we should definitely do a deep dive into that, because so much talked about in the supplemental materials and in that essay that really, when I reread it, sort of opened up sort of new perspectives for me again on Tolkien's work as a whole. It is very much an accounting in ways about decisions he's made in his other creative work, especially in Middle-earth. But what I like about the story is that, among other things, it shows, even though I said it's not the rambunctiousness of Farmer Giles of Ham. It is not the ridiculousness of Father Christmas letters, or Letters from Father Christmas. It does, however, have humor. In fact, I think it's his most viciously satiric thing he ever did, because he really does not like the character of Nokes. And to give a little context, Nokes is a master cook. And again, the idea is that the master cook is kind of almost the chief figure of the particular town, and he is shown to be, in comparison to other master cooks, someone who's clearly in love with the ceremonial trappings and the status, as opposed to anything quote unquote real about the job, inspiring or what's doing. And he relies on an assistant who turns out to be an elf in disguise, and who has, again, as Jared pointed out, has his own agenda, and that there's a final confrontation towards the end of the book, between this apprentice who is now revealed, in fact, to be the Elf King, and Nokes as an old man who seemed to be just lost in his it was almost a Trump-esque portrait. It really was when I was reading that. I'm like, boy, this makes me think of somebody right now. It's clearly Tolkien really having it out with the Babbitt-like figures that he grew up with, the people who always told him, from early age on, it's like, oh, why are you paying attention to that? Or why are you doing that? And it's interesting, too, how in the hands of another writer, it would have just been like, Nokes gets his. But as he points out in the supplemental materials, the Elf King basically sort of, reads him the riot act, but still finds it in his heart to forgive him and gives him sort of a gentler way to go. It's sort of recognized as like, you could argue the Elf King's going, you're beyond hope, you don't understand, but it's more sort of like, it's just, we'll let it go in another way. And I don't know, in a polarized time, it was actually kind of refreshing to find a way to see how people can extend grace, I guess is the best way to put it. So
that is something that the fairy figures that really stood out to me about the Fairy Queen and these figures that are immortal and perilously fair and all that, but they have this ability to extend grace to mortals. They don't really have a reason to go among the mortal, like, why does the Elf King become the Master Cook? Like, but he does, because like he's cool. He's just a cool guy. And I think that gets at something really interesting to me that I feel like we didn't really see that with the elves in Lord of the Rings. Most of them are very standoffish, very kind of done with mortals. Even like Galadriel is nice and all, but I feel like most of that is because they're the ring, the posse that's accompanying the ring bearer. Ditto Elrond, who is a little less unfriendly to mortals, I think, because he is himself half elven. So I kind of like it's a different type of immortal being that we're being introduced here that I find interesting.
Yeah, they're so different from Tolkien elves, and I really appreciate the range. She has the range. The way that the elves in the story function as like agents of inspiration. Like the angels in that Steven Spielberg movie, Holly Hunter. Maybe too deep a cut. Their weird agenda has something to do with inspiring humanity, and you never find out why or what purpose it serves for them. But it's clearly very important to them. And there's a whole section in the essay about this, and I almost wish he hadn't said anything, because it's more interesting to think about it without his input. This star that Smith swallows as a kid inspires him when he becomes a blacksmith. He makes these fantastical, wonderful things, as well as being just a really good blacksmith. He's an artist as well, but without being like the greatest smith of his era. He's just... It's so important to these elves for some reason that this little town has an artist in it, which I think is really cool.
Yeah. Quotidian is maybe a strange word to use, but I think this idea of something, it's not the story, Farmer Giles is a ridiculous story about a run-of-the-mill guy who ends up becoming a king, almost by accident, but in hilarious fashion. Here's someone who never becomes a king, but clearly becomes, an elevated figure of importance. And it's interesting how his importance is measured in different ways. Like towards the end, Nokes just, dismisses him like, oh yeah, that guy just seems to be whatever. So it's not like there's a universal feeling towards him necessarily, but others, particularly think like, wow, look at the wonderful work being done. They appreciate it. They appreciate it without like investing him with a sense of, oh, he should be our leader or anything like that. It's more just an appreciation that he's there.
Yeah, the joy of a job well done, essentially, and taking pleasure in those little things without elevating them, without needing to elevate them to the divine, I guess.
And that's interesting too, because it's clearly it's Tolkien. It wouldn't be a celebration of a Protestant work ethic. Instead, it is more a celebration of a job well done. And I do argue that the two are different. And I won't get into the theological reasons and underpinnings as to why.
You must feel bad at all times about everything you do as a Catholic, or at least that's what I took away from my education for, I don't know, a decade and a half or something.
Oh, dear. Well, we can get back into more about religion, how it functions, because, again, very interesting things in that essay to talk about in more detail. But a question back to you, Oriana, is since you're the one who sort of has brought it up more than a few times as a good subject to really reflect on in our podcast over time, is, the idea of here's an example, you sort of mentioned it, perilously fair, beautiful, it's like, the elf queen. In earlier Tolkien stories, I could easily see it be the case of, Head Smith, somehow ends up marrying the elf queen, as so often happens in Middle-earth. We don't have that here.
No.
Is there anything that sort of strikes you about that? I mean, I have my own thoughts, but I'm kind of interested to hear what you think about this notable change, really, in his pattern.
To me, it kind of harkens back to, it feels very like drawn from Kalevala-ish. Like, the Smith as a major figure is not like uncommon, let's say, in literature that particularly that draws from medieval sources. I do think it's notable that it is a smith that is the protagonist here, and I think that's definitely inspired by Ilmarinen, the smith of Kalevala, who is like very similar to Smith himself in this story. Yes, he's a central figure and he is kind of magical, but he is very human at the same time. That doesn't answer your question at all.
No. This is a good illustration of it, though I like it.
But it does sort of. It is really nice, and that is where the clear biographical, the clear autobiography kind of comes in, where he is just this guy who has a day job, who loves his wife and his children, and maybe doesn't give quite enough to them, is maybe gone a little more often in Faery, than he should be, and I do really appreciate that acknowledgement, even if it is in a story, but it is this sort of public acknowledgement. And one of the sweetest moments to me of this story is when he comes back and from his final journey in Faery, and the son is like, "Oh man, your star's gone. That's like a drag." And the dad's like, "Yeah, And it's like, but you know what? There's a lot of work, and I'm gonna teach you. I'm gonna be the teacher that like I should have been." It's so much quieter than his other stories, and I really appreciate that. And maybe that's a function of age as well.
Yeah,
kind of getting up there in years.
Yeah, his own thoughts that were good. It's something I should mention that one interesting thing I relearned in reading through the supplemental material in the notes was that Tolkien himself did a public reading of the story.
Oh.
He had done various public readings of his works in the past, including an earlier version of Farmer Giles and things like this, just as steps along the way. He was invited to a lecture in Oxford at a particular institution that's in Oxford that's for Catholic study and belief. That was established after the Oxford movement in the 19th century, Blackfriars, I think it is. And in any event, it talks about how the expectation might have been that he would have given some sort of talk, but he ended up presenting a reading of the, at the time, unpublished story. And it's an interesting moment where we see Tolkien interacting with his public in a way that is fairly rare, because, of course, he didn't really do that all that often. There were these very occasional get-togethers and things like this, including the Dutch one that was sort of republicized a couple of years ago. But this one might have been one of his last public events as such, and talks about how there was like it was a word of mouth thing. Oh, Tolkien's doing a thing. And again, this is now a decade plus after Lord of the Rings, and I'm sure enough fan base going, whoa. And so there were like something like 800 people crowding in, and he was apparently reading. And the way it was set up was that the microphone line from him to where it was supposed to be plugged into, too many people were trotting on it or whatever, so it didn't go through. So people started having to lean in to hear him and things like that. And this was on a rainy night too, and it would have been he said pretty hot, his Tolkien's explanation, with all the bodies crammed in there. So it would have been a weirdly sort of close and uncomfortable with all the rain outside. Listen, but kind of interesting, just sort of a way to sort of like, just imagining him reading that. Here's where I'll dig into some more of the supplementary stuff, which I think is kind of interesting. There's some more I want to get into, but first I'll talk about two things where we get a clear sense of how he thinks of this story as different from other particular sources. So in one part, this is in the essay, which again is also titled Smith and Wootton Major. And he basically talks about his distinction about how to enter into Faery. In other words, his idea that he's careful, he's both careful and very wonderfully indistinct about where you cross the line over into Faery. And he basically, there's no way you can map it, is clearly what Tolkien's trying to say. It's not the way it works. So he says, this is a direct quote, "As for place, entry into the geographical bounds of Faery also involves entry into Faery time. How does a mortal enter the geographical realm of Faery? Evidently not in dream or illusion. Physical objects, such as the star, the living flower, and the elvish toy, survive transplantation from Faery to the world. It is common in fairy tales for the entrance to the fairy world to be presented as a journey underground, into a hill or mountain or the like. The origins of this do not concern me here. They lie largely in necrological imagination. But used, they are often mere rationalizations, like the diminution in size of elves, a way of providing for a land of marvels within the same geography," and he underlines this for emphasis, "a land of marvels within the same geography as that of men. They are no more credible and no more interesting than Edgar Rice Burroughs' tales dealing with a vast subterranean world. To me, they kill the very kind of literary belief that they are supposed to produce." Now, that's a pretty hard slam on someone, and but that's also very interesting because that reminded me that he had read Edgar Rice Burroughs' tales of a time, and the creator of Tarzan, the Princess on Mars series, but also the At the Earth's Core series, and popular fictions all. They were, very much pulp things that clearly had an impact over in the UK as much as they had in the US. But it's very interesting to sort of distinguish himself in this particular fashion with that particular author. It shows that he was well aware of a wider context in the English language within his lifetime, as opposed to necessarily deeper sources, which I think is a very interesting riff. The other thing I'll point out, this is from a letter to the U.S. academic Clyde Kilby. And he talks about writing the preface. Sort of skip around here. What's interesting here is how he draws a distinction between what he was trying to do and what C.S. Lewis was trying to do. And this is written after Lewis's death, so there's no way that, this could have, come back to him or anything like this. Again, written this letter sometime mid to late 60s, whenever he wrote to Kilby about this. So he talks about, rereading George MacDonald critically filled me with distaste. I, of course, had never thought of The Golden Key as a story for children, though apparently George MacDonald did. The task proved distasteful to me, but I was relieved of it by the collapse of the project. While striving to say some useful things in a preface, I found it necessary to deal with the term fairy, always necessary nowadays, whether talking to children or adults. Referencing to Jack's letter, Jack being, of course, the nickname of C.S. Lewis, Jack's letter of October 9, 1954 in his recent collection. In the course of this, I tried to give an illustration of Faery and said this could be put into a short story, and then proceeded what is the first version of Smith and Wootton Major. Then I stopped, realizing that the short story had developed an independent life and should be completed as a thing in and of itself, of course. If I had gone on, I should have only written a severely critical or anti-essay on George MacDonald. Unnecessary and a pity, since George MacDonald has performed great services for other minds, such as Jack's. But he was evidently born loving moral allegory, and I was born with a distinctive distaste for it. Phantastes, which is one of MacDonald's more noted works, Phantastes wakened him, referring to Lewis. Phantastes wakened him and afflicted me with profound dislike. And he goes on from there. He does also talk a little bit more about religion as such in the story, but he writes more about that separately in the essay, and I'll save that for a future talk. So that's interesting because it's sort of Tolkien laying down in very, very clear terms his distinction for his creative work on a whole. Because you can expand this out back to Lord of the Rings, where he explicitly says that he feels that Lord of the Rings is a Christian work. And there's been argument about how much of a Catholic work it is. I think arguably it is. But clearly he's not interested in just telling you, he's never interested in going the Lewis route. He hates it. He really, really does not like it. That's interesting to me because I think there's something to tease out there about how do you sell a message, maybe is the way to put it, or how do you intend a message. I don't know. What are your sort of thoughts on this? I mean, you guys might have grown up with more of a hey, here's a story to read thing that was in your particular thing that I didn't necessarily get. I mean, I read Bible stories, but I wasn't given like here is a fiction story clearly based on the Bible. You must read this, and I don't know if that's what's kind of your guys' upbringing or not. Or
I mean, kind of. Especially with C.S. Lewis.
Yeah. Jared, you're like, it's weird because my dad was actually, he never converted to Catholicism. He's like Presbyterian or something. And I feel like my mom was never actually all that religious, but we went to church, we went to Mass every Saturday. We were Saturday Mass people, and I, went through all this stuff and got confirmed. But like, what was funny was the Bible always felt allegorical to me. All of that stuff always felt allegorical. And I think that was why I liked Lord of the Rings so much. I read it after Chronicles of Narnia and was like, oh, this is it. And it's the same reason I think I love... there was some sort of big discourse recently where some dummy on Twitter... a few months ago or something, maybe even definitely last year, was talking about movies should only have good politics, or, oh, it's a shame that movies are only politics now. Like, it was a very messy, dumb several days on Twitter, but it made me think about Parasite in particular, which does the thing that I think Lord of the Rings does really well, which is have a very clear point of view while simply just telling an amazing story. You don't need to read it on an allegorical level or a metaphorical level, or you don't need to read politics or religion into either of them at all and just have a wonderful time. And I think that's why they're both, to me, much more effective than stuff like Narnia. And I think, clearly Tolkien agrees.
Yeah. It's the difference between having readings that are available to you and having the only reading which the author wants you to take away.
Yes.
Which Lewis was really big on, at least in the Narnia books. Yeah, I mean, we had all the Chronicles of Narnia growing up, and it was like, this is very clearly Jesus dying and coming back to life, and then in this book there's, I don't know, messages about other stuff that you need to know. Suddenly I'm forgetting what they all are. What are the books of the... but they've all got very clear points to trying to make.
Yeah.
Whereas Tolkien is just like, I don't know, if you want to read it that way, you can.
Yeah. Here's the part from the essay where he delves into, again, Tolkien's essay on his story, where he delves into more about the religious factor. And I think it's very interesting because he does intentionally expand it out to talk about his creative work in general. And so that's why I think it's very important to really sort of hear this, and, it needs to be, should be more widely understood. So here's how he begins. As always, with the typical statement, there is no need to hunt for allegory. Yeah, of course.
We weren't.
Yeah. The more you talk about it, the more we'll look for it. There's no need to hunt for allegory. Such teaching as the slender story contains is implicit, and would be no less present as if it were a plain narrative of historical events. But, and then he adds very carefully and clearly in parentheses, as in my stories generally, close parentheses, it will be observed that there is no religion, and he underlines religion. He's clearly making a note of this. There is no church or temple. Among the professions, there is no parson or priest. And I'll step out here briefly, noting that in Farmer Giles of Hand, there is a parson. That's a thing. We don't have that here. Back to Tolkien. The festivals are the nearest approach. To judge by the only one named, the winter feast at midwinter, they must have been seasonal, associated with spring and summer and harvest and the like. In origin, such festivals are not separable from religion, in quotes. But in Wootton Major at the time of the tale, they have evidently no longer any religious reference, no more than our surviving quarter days as such. He then adds in parentheses, no power or powers are by any ceremony propitiated, supplicated, or thanked. In parentheses. In a story written by a religious man, this is a plain indication that religion is not absent, but subsumed. The tale is not about religion, or in particular about its relation to other things. It does not therefore appear as such, heavy underline. Otherwise, a short essay on its point would have been better than a tale. He then goes on to just illustrate basically the breakdown of how he's equating things throughout the story. The Great Hall is the equivalent of, in quotes, an allegory, as he puts it, of the village church. About Master Cook is the idea of the equivalent of a priest and so forth. And he then goes on to say, the Great Hall, however, is no longer painted or decorated. If antique carvings, whether grotesques like gargoyles or beautiful and of religious import, are preserved at all, it is by mere custom. The hall is kept rainproof, weatherproof, and warm. That is the prime object of any care spent on it. Festivals are mere public assemblies, for talk assisted by eating and drinking. There are no longer songs, music, or dances. And the church has been reformed. Clearly his take on Protestantism right there. Or sleeping in, it's like, Memory survives of, quote, merrier days, but most of the village would not have approved of any revival of them. That a master cook should himself sing is regarded out of accord of his office. Industry and sober hard work are mainly to be commended, but the profit moment for such assiduity is becoming dominant. The less commercially profitable an occupation, the less it is esteemed. He then goes on to say, you can read a lot into that, but then he goes on to say, but Faery, the realm, is not religious, he underscores it. It is fairly evident that it is not heaven or paradise. Certainly its inhabitants, elves, are not angels or emissaries of God, direct. The tale does not deal with religion itself. The elves are not busy with a plan to reawake religious devotion in Wooten. The cooking allegory would not be suitable to any such import. Faery represents at its weakest a breaking out, at least in mind, from the iron ring of the familiar, still more from the adamantine ring of belief that it is known, possessed, controlled, and so, ultimately, all that is worth being considered, a constant awareness of the world beyond these rings. Yeah, interesting that he would bring up ring in the commentary there, but he clearly was well about it. So that there's much more to that, but I mean that's a pretty heady dose of him talking about his creative impulses there on a fairly intense level. It really is a pity there's not more of this, and it's also very interesting because I'm sure we'll get to it one day. But his story Leaf by Niggle is not unrelated to Smith of Wootton Major in the sense that it's somebody who's working on or appreciates the finer things in art. But Leaf by Niggle is very explicitly a Catholic parable. As close to it as possible, where this is not, and he is addressing other forms there. But you take that out, and it really does say something about that lack of religion in Middle Earth that is so often commented upon. That you so many epic fantasies, you always have your priests or your gods or things like this. Nope, not in Middle Earth. You barely have anything. In Numenor, you have the mountaintop ceremony 3 times a year, and that's it. You have the moment where Faramir looks to the west when they're having dinner at Henneth noon, and that's about it. There's tiny little moments here and there, but otherwise it's just again subsumed. And he says that in the case of Smith and Wootton Major, it's clearly meant to be subsumed. So I mean, so much to unpack. I mean, I almost want to stop there, see if there's anything about that. I mean, Jared had read it already, but did any of that sort of strike you in particular, Oriana, or?
Yeah, well, I keep coming back to probably one of the more widely read Tolkien letters, the one that's in the front of the Silmarillion, where he talks about subcreation and finding the balance between subcreation and creation and what is offensive to the creator and what isn't. It's always struck me how deep that feeling of being torn runs through literally everything he writes. It is interesting.
Yeah, the sort of like how to dwell in 2 worlds at once.
Yeah.
Is arguably just a constant theme.
Which does go back to the religious thing is of living in the world but not being of the world and that struggle.
maybe to focus on, since we've talked quite a bit already, and this otherwise have to go on, maybe just to focus a little bit more on some of the joys of the story and how it's illustrated in particular. So I think that some of the images he comes up here, where he's writing of a Faery as a fantastic realm, are wonderful because it allows him to sort of stretch beyond Middle Earth as this conceptual playground. So the image of Lake of Glass with the things of this. I mean, that's really just a brief but very striking portrait of something in there. And if he had put that into Middle Earth, there would be a name and a lot of explanations and things like this, and he would find himself obsessing over that. He didn't have to do that here. It's almost sort of like it's almost freeing, the same way that the birch, which protects him when he accidentally steps onto the lake, and then the wind kicks up, and then he hides in the birch, and the birch at the end it tells him, it talks to him. It's not an ant voice; it's more the spirit of the tree. And unlike the wonderfully curious ants, this birch is telling him, "You don't belong here. Get out."
Which again feels very Finnish, feels very Kalevala. Talking trees and birches in particular play a very prominent role.
That moment is so... I think we sort of mentioned that the mood of the story is very elegiac. It's very kind of sad and poetic and maybe a little dreamlike. Is that in sheltering him from the wind, the birch is bent almost to the ground and loses all of its leaves, and it starts crying. So when he leaves, he's covered in the tears of the birch tree, and it's such an eerie, powerful moment. Even if, I don't quite understand why. It's not like the birch has any personality before then. It's just there. It affects me in a way I don't really quite understand. And there's a lot of little moments in the story like that. Yeah, just the way it cries. It's like,
yeah. That tree moment, weirdly enough, makes me think of it's by no means 1-to-1, but it almost makes me think of something more well known in American culture, which is Shel Silverstein's The Giving Tree. There's it's interesting sort of parallel there of this. That's different thematics, but the same sort of thing. A person survives, but at what cost? And the tree has borne the cost. But there are so many striking, multiple strange images. When he stumbles across, when Smith stumbles across the hidden vale where the elf women are dancing, it's a wonderfully vivid moment. But then I think of moments more like that's that mountaintop height where he meets the elf queen and understands her for she is, and there's that huge host that's around of warriors, and then there's a soul trumpet, and then it goes, and it's just sort of like these strange things happen, and also that vivid moment, which is one of Baynes' best illustrations, when he comes to the shore, and the shore, beyond the shore, and then the lands of Unlight where the elves fight, and they come back and they're singing, and it's just this martial display that Smith can't take it in. It's too powerful. It's very much the sublime is conveyed heavily in the story. Like the humanity can only take in so much. The human perspective can only really get a part of that. And the illustrations are really just lovely. I mean, I love and the critical edition provides both the originals and the redrawn ones that she did a few years later for a later version, which are more or less the same, but just provide more detail, sometimes different perspectives. And one of my favorite bits is the big 2-page version of the serving of the great cake, the one that Smith takes the piece from and swallows the star in the beginning, where you have the kids. Wonderful purchase of all these kids looking up going, oh wow, the marvelous construction of this cake, this fairy cake with the little fairy queen on top of the mountain. And then you have Nokes, the master chef there, just with a very smug, self-satisfied look in his face like, isn't it lovely, kids? And Alf, his assistant, standing behind with the knife to cut the cake, and he's got sort of a frown on his face like, yeah, you don't know, do you? I love those Baynesian details, and I love her riffs on medieval approaches. I think really comes to the fore here. And the moment that I mentioned in the prologue, where Smith comes home and casts his shadow on the wall, and the family's all close, and his son sees it, and is like, wow! And just this image where the shadow shows the star on his forehead more than the figure himself is really something. It's just a marvelous exercise. It really does, just underscore that feeling of, it's meant to be a story that's set in ancient times, but not anywhere specific. and is another wonderful synthesis between illustrator and author. I could go on. So seek it out. Trust me. Yeah, just read it. If you get this book through get the story through another edition with other illustrations, and there have been other ones besides Alan Lee, by all means. But seek out Pauline.
Yeah.
Whatever else you do, find hers.
She's so good.
It's truly marvelous. Yeah, I don't know if I have any final thoughts on it. It is short. It's shorter than Farmer Giles, if I remember right. And arguably he had shorter tales. Mr. Bliss is something we'll have to talk about in combination with other things down the line, however we get to that. But yeah, it's. There is one thing about it that, I don't want to say disappoints me, but I had remembered it wrong, and I really wished that how I had remembered it wrong was how he had written it, but I guess he wasn't that far, and that was, as the story ends, the idea is that the elves have to tell him he must give up the star. The star has to be gone and go on to another generation for another inspiration. And I had remembered it in my brain wrongly that the next person it went to was a young girl. Rather than a boy, and I really wish that Tolkien had allowed himself the stretch to do that, because that would have because the idea of have it be always that there is a sense that it's always men who get the chance to get the star and all that, and I'm like I'm sorry my memory got it wrong. Is what it is. So the story functions as it does. It's fine, but I would have appreciated that a little more. It shows that the story does have its limitations. It's not perfect, but what is. It is Tolkien. There you go. And but aside from that, I think that would be the only thing I would actually change about it. Otherwise, if I somehow had the power to do that, which of course I do not. Yeah, no. Any sort of final thoughts maybe on this one?
I've got a few actually.
Yeah. Let's hear them.
Like the moment he is the one who gets to choose who gets the star next, and he does pick. I think it's his grandson.
Nokes' grandson,
like his grandnephew or something like that.
Something like that.
A relative, a young relative, definitely. Yeah.
Oh wait, and it's so interesting to me that it's not inherited precisely.
Yeah,
like it doesn't. He lets it leave his family as if he recognized not his family entirely, because again, relative. But it almost, I don't know how autobiographical Smith is, but like. Right. It's. I know it couldn't go to his son because his son is too old at that point. But it's weird somehow. I mean, I think it's a cool storytelling choice, but it is a little weird that it doesn't go to his direct descendants. That he's generous enough to let it go somewhere else, or recognizes that his family's had it long enough, or something. I don't know what that says precisely, except that he's humble and recognizes the best person for the job, or something like that. Such a strange little moment, I think. And then the other final thought I have is that we did talk about this briefly, but the substitute for religion in Wootton Major is feasting.
Yeah.
Which I love. Not just because I like cooking and eating, but I think in a lot of other stories, when you have something substituting for religion, the impulse is to have it be something a little more ethereal, like, oh, we all sing, and that's religion, or we all paint, and that's religion. I think it'd be food makes it so much more grounded, and that's part of the sort of mundanity of the whole thing, is the way inspiration is transmitted through eating, just like a really indulgent cake.
Yeah.
I mean, there's echoes, I think, of the Eucharist and stuff in there, obviously. But I love that choice as a metaphor for religion. The feast hall and the master chef is the equivalent of the priest, and I love that. The earthiness, the embodiment.
Yeah.
Oriana, any last thoughts yourself?
One of the things that we kind of touched on in the beginning was Nokes, who is the closest we come to an antagonist in this story. And what I love about Nokes is that he is all style and no substance, in that, all he cares about is how things look. He cares about the sweetness of things, but has no idea how to actually make the cake underneath the icing. Which is actually like which ties in very nicely to Faery, which, and fairy stories in general, which, magic is sort of the icing on all fairy tales. But if you don't understand what the substance of Faery, you don't end up with a very good story. Certainly, you don't end up with a very good cake. So I really appreciate that that sort of thematic neatness there that Nokes provides us.
Yeah, that makes me think of two things. First, yeah, the you could say it's very obvious, but I think it's clear that that Tolkien did not like you could call it, using a food thing, the treacliness of the so many fairy stories, but also the treacliness of what adults think kids want or like. And that is a broader theme in general. And he clearly has this very, very about both MacDonald's work and then Lewis's work in turn, but also I'm sure other things. He clearly that wasn't his thing. He really, and frankly, I'm with him on that one. This assumption is sort of like how do you talk with kids? How do you deal with kids? And in a weird way, it is interesting and illustrative that you have differences of that, not quite set up in opposition, but in how Nokes speaks to the kids at the feast versus how Smith speaks with his own family and with his son and things like this, which is there again, there's not as much frankly in comparison, but you do get a sense that there are different ways of how you treat younger people, especially the younger people in your life if you happen to be a parent. So I think that's very, very interesting. And the other thing that just occurred to me, I don't know why I didn't think of this earlier, is that On Fairy Stories, the famous essay itself, Tolkien uses another culinary metaphor, and that's when he talks about the bones in the soup in terms of, creating the story. It's sort of like, in order to, I forget the exact thing, it's in the writing, I'm going to butcher this and I apologize, but the idea is that in enjoying the soup, do you want to actually look at the bones so much? How deep do you delve? And again, I just think it's interesting, building on Jared's point, that there is that food metaphor that provides a through line, arguably because maybe it's one of the most universally human of things. We all eat, it's in some respects, no matter what else you do, everyone eats. And so that could maybe more than a particular art form or all that is maybe the best way to do it there. So yeah, I think I'll just draw with a close that's saying that, again, if you haven't read it, please do. It is short. It will not take much time. It does provide a little sort of insight into Tolkien's artistry in general. It's another little element, facet of the whole, and it would be interesting, much like with Farmer Giles, if there was an eventual animated version, if someone wanted to do it in the style, preferably of Baynes, because I think that would be a really lovely way to tell the story. But yeah, there it is, and I leave it out there for your enjoyment. We've wrapped up this episode. It is now time to turn the rotation once again, and that means it is Oriana's turn. Oriana, what is next month's subject going to be about?
So, my fiance and I were rewatching the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings films, and we turned to each other at one point and went, "How do orcs reproduce?" We will not. But we are going to be talking about orcs. The genesis. Once again, how the conception of the orcs as it changed over time. The racism. We'll have to talk about because it's not good, guys. But so yeah, we'll just be chatting about orcs as a concept. And, I might even like to get into how other people have taken that concept and just totally run with it. We got your World of Warcraft, your Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
So
that's a good one. That's a big one. So yeah, and that's a good way to, because the influence on other creative outlets has been big. So, and no lie. So, okay, well, that's fantastic. Something to think about. There's a lot of material that goes back. Boy, that goes back a lot to the basic roots of the whole thing. So, but we'll let you lead that one when the time comes. That'll be in a month's time or so. Once again, thank you everyone for listening. We really appreciate it. We look forward to another year's worth of doing things. A big year on many levels. Since again, we're going to have we have the big major adaptation coming out, and just remember, in 5 months' time, we have a new Tolkien book coming. So that'll be we got the Nature of Middle-earth is we're rapidly coming up to that, and we'll have thoughts to say then, I'm sure. But in the meantime, do enjoy your January. Do get through things. Stay safe. Stay safe.
Mm-hmm.
The vaccines are rolling out, but please, until the time, stay safe and in all that, whatever you do. And we will talk to you all next month. So until then, thanks very much, as always, for listening. Goodbye. Thanks again for listening to this episode of By the Bywater. Please subscribe and rate us via your favorite podcast listening options.
Episodes and show notes are at megaphonic.fm/bythebywater, all one word. You can also message us through here. Email us at bythebywater@megaphonic.fm or follow us on Twitter at By-The-Bywater.
You can also follow us individually on Twitter and ask questions there. I'm at Vandroid Helsing.
I'm at Schwinter, SCHWINDTER.
And I'm Ned Raggett, 2 G's, 2 T's. By the Bywater is a proud member of Megaphonic Podcast Network. Find all our fancy little shows at megaphonic.fm. We hope you join us again next time. Until then, Namarie.